suspicious. But Omaha I pumped the Italian. Ah, Potter murmured. The mysterious Dr. Caffredi. Mysterious exactly, Hastings continued. That's precisely the right word for him. What's he doing down here in the country? Well, I'll tell you. He was artist at Claud Amory's formula. He's almost certainly the emissary of a foreign government. You know the kind of thing I mean. I do indeed, Hastings, Potter responded with a smile. After all, I do occasionally go to this cinema, you know. And if it turns out that Sir Claud was indeed poisoned, Hastings was now well into his stride. It makes Dr. Corelli more than ever the prime suspect. Remember the Borgias. Poison is a very Italian sort of crime. But what I'm afraid of is that Corelli will get away with the formula in his possession. He will not do that, my friend, said Poirot, shaking his head. Well, how on earth can you be so sure? Hastings inquired. Poirot leaned back in his chair and brought the tips of his fingers together in his familiar manner. I do not exactly know, Hastings, he admitted. I cannot be sure, of course, but I have a little idea. What do you mean? Where do you think that formula is now, my clever collaborator? Poirot asked. Well, how should I know? Poirot looked at Hastings for a moment, as though giving his friend a chance to consider the question. Then, think, my friend, he said encouragingly. Arrange your ideas. Be methodical. Be orderly. That is the secret of success. When Hastings merely shook his head with a perplexed air, the detective attempted to give his colleague a clue. There is only one place where it can be, Poirot told him. And where's that, for heaven's sake? Hastings asked, with a distinct note of irritation in his voice. In this room, of course, Poirot announced, a triumphant Cheshire cat-like grin appearing on his face. What on earth do you mean? But yes, Hastings, just consider the facts. We know from the good Treadwell that Sir Claud took certain precautions to prevent the formula from being removed from this room. When he sprang his little surprise and announced our imminent arrival, it is quite certain, therefore, that the thief still had the formula on his person. What must he do? He dare not risk having it found on him when I arrived. He can do only two things. He can return it in the manner suggested by Sir Claud, or else he can hide it somewhere under cover of that 1 minute of total darkness. Since he did not do the first, he must have done the second. Voila! It is obvious to me that the formula is hidden in this room. By God, Poirot! Hastings exclaimed in great excitement. I believe you're right. Let's look for it. He rose quickly and moved to the desk. By all means, if it amuses you, Poirot responded, but there is someone who will be able to find it more easily than you can. Oh, and who is that? Asked Hastings. Poirot twirled his moustache with enormous energy. Why, the person who hid it, Tavaler, exclaimed, accompanying his words with the kind of gesture more suitably employed by a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. You mean I mean, Poirot explained patiently to his colleague, that sooner or later the thief will try to recapture his booty. One or the other of us, therefore, must constantly remain on guard. Hearing the door being opened slowly and cautiously, he broke off and beckoned Hastings to join him by the gramophone, out of the immediate sight of anyone entering the room. The door opened, and Barbara Amory entered the room cautiously. Taking a chair from near the wall, she placed it in front of the bookcase, climbed on it, and reached for the tin box containing the drugs. At that moment, Hastings suddenly sneezed, and Barbara, with a start, dropped the box. Oh, she exclaimed in some confusion. I didn't know there was anyone here. Hastings rushed forward and retrieved the box, which Poirot then took from him. Permit me, mademoiselle, said the detective. I am sure that it is too heavy for you. He moved to the table and placed the tin box upon it. It is a little collection of yours, he asked. The birds' eggs, the seashells, perhaps. No, I'm afraid it's much more prosaic, Monsieur Poirot, replied Barbara with a nervous laugh. Nothing but pills and powders. But surely, said Poirot, one so young, so full of health and vigor, has no need of these bagatelles. Oh, it's not for me, Barbara assured him. It's for Lucia. She's got such an awful headache this morning. Ah, la pauvre dame, murmured Poirot, his voice dripping with sympathy. She sent you for these pills, then? Yes, replied Barbara. I gave her a couple of aspirin that she wanted some real dope. I said I'd bring up the whole outfit. That is, if no one were here. Poirot, leaning his hands on the box, spoke thoughtfully. If no one were here. And why would that matter, mademoiselle? Well, you know what it is in a place like this, Barbara explained. Pass, fuss. I mean, Aunt Caroline, for instance, like a clucky old hen, and Richard's a damn nuisance and completely useless into the bargain, as men always are when you're ill. Poirot nodded in comprehension. I understand, he told Barbara, bowing his head as a sign that he accepted her explanation. He rubbed his fingers along the lid of the case containing the drugs and then looked quickly at his hands. Pausing for a moment, he cleared his throat with a slightly affected sound and then went on. And do you know, mademoiselle, that you are very fortunate in your domestic servants? What do you mean? Asked Barbara. Poirot showed her the tin box. See? He pointed out. On this box, there is no speck of dust. To mount on a chair and bother to dust so high up there, not all domestics would be so conscientious. Yes, Barbara agreed. I told it all last night that it wasn't dusty. You had this case of drugs done last night? Poirot asked her. Yes, after dinner. It's full of old hospital stuff, you know. Let us have a look at these hospital drugs, suggested Poirot as he opened the box. Taking out some files, and holding them up, he raised his eyebrows exaggeratedly. Ah, strychnine, atropine. Ah, very pretty little collection. Ah, here is a tube of hyoscine, nearly empty. What? Exclaimed Barbara. Why, they were all full last night, I'm sure they were. Voila. Poirot held out a tube to her, then replaced it in the box. This is very curious. What do you call them, files were full? Where exactly was his case of drugs last night, mademoiselle? Well, when we took it down, we placed it on this table, Barbara informed him, and Dr. Corelli was looking through the drugs and commenting on them, and... She broke off as Lucia entered the room. Richard Amory's wife looked surprised to see the two men. Her pale, proud face seemed careworn in the daylight, and there was something wistful in the curve of her mouth. Barbara hastened to her. Oh, darling, you shouldn't have got up, she told Lucia. I was just coming up to you. My headache is much better, Barbara, dear, Lucia replied, her eyes fixed on Poirot. I came down because I wanted to speak to Monsieur Poirot. Oh, but my pet, don't you think you should? Please, Barbara. Oh, very well, you know best, said Barbara as she moved to the door, which Hastings rushed to open for her. When she'd gone, Lucia moved to a chair and sat down. Monsieur Poirot, she began. I am at your service, madame, Poirot responded politely. Lucia spoke hesitantly and her voice trembled a little. Monsieur Poirot, she began again. Last night, I made a request to you. I asked you to stay on here. I begged you to do so. This morning, I see that I made a mistake. Are you sure, madame? Poirot asked her quietly. Quite sure. I was nervous last night and overwrought. I am most grateful to you for doing what I asked, but now it is better that you should go. Ah, c'est comme ça, Poirot murmured beneath his breath. Aloud, his response was merely a non-committal, Ainsi, madame. Rising, Lucia glanced at him nervously as she asked, That is settled then? Not quite, madame, replied Poirot, taking a step towards her. If you remember, you expressed the doubt that your father-in-law had died in natural death. I was hysterical last night, Lucia insisted. I did not know what I was saying. Then you are now convinced, Poirot persisted, that his death was after all natural? Absolutely, Lucia declared. Poirot's eyebrows rose a trifle. He looked at her in silence. Why do you look at me like that? Lucia asked with alarm in her voice. Because, madame, it is sometimes difficult to set a dog on the scent, but once he has found it, nothing on earth will make him leave it, not if he is a good dog. And I, madame, Hercule Poirot, am a very good dog. In great agitation, Lucia declared, Oh, but you really must go. I beg you, I implore you. You don't know what harm you may do by remaining. Harm? Asked Poirot. To you, madame? To all of us, Monsieur Poirot. I can't explain further, but I beg you to accept my word that it is so. From the first moment I saw you, I trusted you, please. She broke off as the door opened and Richard, looking shocked, entered with Dr. Graham. Lucia, her husband exclaimed as he caught sight of her. Richard, what is it? Asked Lucia anxiously as she rushed to his side. What has happened? Something new has happened. I can see it in your face. What is it? Nothing, my dear, replied Richard with an attempted reassurance in his turn. But do you mind leaving us for a moment? Lucia's eyes searched his face. Can't I? She began but hesitated as Richard moved to the door and opened it. Please, he repeated, with a final backward glance in which there was a distinct element of fear. Lucia left the room. Putting his Gladstone bag on the coffee table, Dr. Graham crossed to the settee and sat down. I'm afraid this is a bad business, Monsieur Poirot, he announced to the detective. A bad business, you see. You have discovered what caused the death of Sir Claud? Asked Poirot. His death was due to poisoning by a powerful vegetable alkaloid, Graham declared. Such as hyoscine, perhaps? Poirot suggested, picking up the tin box of drugs from the table. Why, yes, exactly. Dr. Graham sounded surprised at the detective's accurate surmise. Poirot took the case to the other side of the room, placing it on the gramophone table, and Hastings followed him there. Meanwhile, Richard Amory joined the doctor on the settee. What does this mean, actually? Richard asked Dr. Graham. Oh, for one thing, it means the involvement of the police, was Graham's prompt reply. Oh my God, exclaimed Richard, this is terrible. Can't you possibly hush it up? Dr. Graham looked at Richard Amory steadily before he spoke slowly and deliberately. My dear Richard, he said, believe me, nobody could be more pained and grieved at this horrible calamity than I am, especially since, under the circumstances, it does not seem likely that the poison could have been self-administered. Richard paused for several seconds before he spoke. Are you saying it's murder? He asked in an unsteady voice. Dr. Graham did not speak, but nodded solemnly. Murder! Exclaimed Richard. What on earth are we going to do? Adopting a brisker, more businesslike manner, Graham explained the procedure to be followed. I have notified the coroner. The inquest will be held tomorrow at the King's Arms. And, you mean, the police will have to be involved. There's no way out of it. There is not. Surely you must realize that, Richard, said Dr. Graham. Richard's tone was frantic as he began to explain, but why didn't you warn me? And now come on, Richard, take a hold of yourself. I'm sure you understand that I have only taken such steps as I thought absolutely necessary. Graham interrupted him. After all, no time should be lost in matters of this kind. My God, exclaimed Richard. Dr. Graham addressed Amory in a kindlier tone. Richard, I do understand. This has been a terrible shock to you. But there are things I must ask you about. Do you feel equal to answering a few questions? Richard made a visible effort to pull himself together. What do you want to know? He asked. First of all, said Graham, what food and drink did your father have at dinner last night? Oh, let's see, we all had the same. Soup, fried sorrel, cutlets, and we finished off with a fruit salad. Now what about drink? Continued Dr. Graham. Richard considered for a moment before replying. My father and my aunt drank burgundy, and so did Raynor, I think. I stuck with whiskey and soda, and Dr. Corelli drank white wine throughout the meal. Ah, yes, the mysterious Dr. Corelli, Graham murmured. Excuse me, Richard, but how much precisely do you know about this man? Interested to hear Richard Amory's reply to this, Hastings moved closer to the true man. In answer to Dr. Graham, Richard declared, I know nothing about him. I never met him or even heard of him until yesterday. But he is a friend of your wife? Asked the doctor. Apparently he is. Does she know him intimately? Oh no, he's a mere acquaintance, I gather. Graham made a little clicking sound with his tongue and shook his head. You've not allowed him to leave the house, I hope? He asked. No, Richard assured him. I pointed out to him last night that until this matter was cleared up, the business of the formula being stolen, it would be best for him to remain here at the house. In fact, I sent down to the inn where he had a room and had his things brought up here. Didn't he make any protest at all? Graham asked in some surprise. Oh no, in fact he's agreed quite eagerly. Was Graham's only about him, he asked. Well now, what about this room? Poirot approached the two men. The doors were locked last night. They tried with the butler, he assured Dr. Graham. And the keys were given to me. Everything is exactly as it was, except that we have moved the chairs, as you see. Dr. Graham looked at the coffee cup on the table. Pointing to it, he asked, Is that the cup? He went across to the table, picked up the cup, and sniffed at it. Richard, he asked, is this the cup your father drank from? I better take it. It'll have to be analyzed. Carrying the cup over to the coffee table, he opened his bag. Richard sprang to his feet. What, surely you don't think, he began, but then broke off. It seems highly unlikely, Graham told him, that the poison could have been administered at dinner. A most likely explanation is that the hyoscine was added to Sir Claud's coffee. Richard tried to utter as he rose and took a step towards the doctor, but then broke off with a despairing gesture and left the room abruptly through the French windows into the garden. Dr. Graham took a small cardboard box of cotton wool from his bag and carefully packed the cup in it, talking to Poirot as he did so. A nasty business, he confided. I'm not at all surprised that Richard Amory is upset. The newspapers will make the most of this Italian doctor's friendship with his wife. And mud tends to stick, Monsieur Poirot. Melt tends to stick. Poor lady. She was probably wholly innocent. A man obviously made her acquaintance in some plausible way. They're astonishingly clever, these foreigners. Of course, I suppose I shouldn't be talking this way as though the thing were a foregone conclusion, but what else is one to imagine? You think it leaps to the yes? Poirot asked him, exchanging glances with Hastings. Well, after all, Dr. Graham explained, Sir Claud's invention was valuable. This foreigner comes along of whom nobody knows anything, an Italian. Sir Claud is mysteriously poisoned. Ah, yes, the butchers, exclaimed Poirot. My beg your pardon, asked the doctor. Nothing. Dr. Graham picked up his bag and prepared to leave, holding out his hand to Poirot. I'd best be off. Goodbye for the present, Monsieur le Docteur, said Poirot as they shook hands. At the door, Graham paused and looked back. Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot. You will see that nobody disturbs anything in this room until the police arrive, won't you? That's extremely important. Most certainly, I shall make myself responsible for it, Poirot assured him. As Graham left, closing the door behind him, Hastings observed dryly, "You know, Poirot, I shouldn't like to be ill in this house. For one thing, there appears to be a poisoner at loose in the place, and for another, I am not at all sure I trust that young doctor." Poirot gave Hastings a quizzical look. "Let us hope that we will not be in this house long enough to become ill," he said, moving to the fireplace and pressing the bell. "And now, my dear Hastings, to work," he announced, as he rejoined his colleague who was contemplating the coffee table with a puzzled expression. "What are you going to do?" Hastings asked. "You and I, my friend," replied Poirot with a twinkle in his eye, "are going to interview Cesare Borgia." Treadwell entered in response to Poirot's call. "You rang, sir?" the butler asked. "Yes, Treadwell. Will you please ask the Italian gentleman, Dr. Carvetti, if he would be kind enough to come here?" "Certainly, sir," Treadwell replied. He left the room, and Poirot went to the table to pick up the case of drugs. "It would be well, I think," he confided to Hastings, "if we were to put these books of so very dangerous drugs back in its proper place. Let us above all things be neat and orderly." Handing the tin box to Hastings, Poirot took a chair to the bookcase and climbed onto it. "Hurry, old cry for neatness and symmetry, eh?" Hastings exclaimed. "Well, there's more to it than that, I imagine." "What do you mean, my friend?" asked Poirot. "I know what it is. You don't want to scare Corelli. After all, who handled those stripes last night? My style as he did. If he saw them down on the table, it might put him on his guard, eh, Poirot?" Poirot tapped Hastings on the head. "How astute is my friend Hastings," he declared, taking the case from him. "I know you too well," Hastings insisted. "You can't throw dust in my eyes." As Hastings spoke, Poirot drew a finger along the top of the bookshelf, sweeping dust down into his friend's upturned face. "It seems to me, my dear Hastings, that is precisely what I have done," Poirot exclaimed as he gingerly drew a finger along the shelf again, making a grimace as he did so. "It appears that I have praised the domestics too soon. This shelf is thick with dust. I wish I had a good wet duster in my hand to clean it up." "My dear Poirot," Hastings laughed, "you're not a housemaid." "Alas, no," observed Poirot sadly. "I am only a detective." "Well, I to detect up there," Hastings declared, "so get down." "As you say, there is nothing," Poirot began, and then stopped dead, standing quite still on the chairs that turned to stone. "What is it?" Hastings asked him impatiently, adding, "Do get down, Poirot. Dr. Corelli will be here at any minute. You don't want her to find you up there, do you?" "You are right, my friend," Poirot agreed as he got down slowly from the chair. His face wore a solemn expression. "What on earth's the matter?" asked Hastings. "It is that I am thinking of something," Poirot replied with a faraway look in his eyes. "What are you thinking of?" "Dust, Hastings." "Dust," said Poirot in an altered voice. The door opened and Dr. Corelli entered the room. He and Poirot greeted each other with the greatest of ceremony, each politely speaking the other's native tongue. Monsieur Poirot," Corelli began, "vous voulez me questionner?" "Si, signor dottore, se lei permette," Poirot replied. "Re parla italiano." "Si, ma preferisco parlare in francese." "Alors," said Corelli, "qu'est-ce que vous voulez me demander?" "I say," Hastings interjected with a certain irritation in his voice, "what the devil is all this?" "Ah, the poor Hastings is not a linguist. I had forgotten," Poirot smiled. "We had better speak English." "I beg your pardon, of course," Corelli agreed. He addressed Poirot with an air of great frankness. I am glad that you have sent for me, Monsieur Poirot, he declared. How do you, Madame Soy, should myself have requested an interview? Indeed, remarked Poirot, indicating a chair by the table. Corelli sat, while Poirot seated himself in the armchair, and Hastings made himself comfortable on the settee. Yes, the Italian doctor continued, as it happens I have business in London of an urgent nature. Play continue, Poirot encouraged him. Yes. Of course I quite appreciate the position last night. A valuable document has been stolen. I was the only stranger present. Naturally, I was only too willing to remain, to permit myself to be searched, in fact to insist on being searched. As a man of honor I could do nothing else. Quite so, Poirot agreed, but today is different, replied Coretti. I have, as I say, urgent business in London. And you wish to take your departure? Exactly. It seems most reasonable, Poirot declared. Do you not think so, Hastings? Hastings made no reply, but looked as though he did not think it at all reasonable. Perhaps a word from you, Monsieur Poirot, to Mr. Amory would be in order, Corelli suggested. I should like to avoid any unpleasantness. My good offices are at your disposal, Monsieur le Docteur, Poirot assured him. And now, perhaps you can assist me with one or two details. I should be only too happy to do so, Corelli replied. Poirot considered for a moment before asking, Old friend of yours? A very old friend, said Corelli. He sighed. It was a delightful surprise running across us so unexpectedly in this out-of-the-way spot. Unexpectedly, you say? Poirot asked. Quite unexpectedly, Corelli replied with a quick glance at the detective. Quite unexpectedly, Poirot repeated. Fancy that. A sudden tension had crept into the atmosphere. Corelli looked at Poirot sharply but said nothing. You are interested in the latest discoveries of science? Poirot asked him. Certainly, I am a doctor. Ah, but that does not quite follow, surely, Poirot observed. A new vaccine, a new ray, a new germ, all these, yes, but a new explosive? Surely that is not quite the province of a doctor of medicine. Science should be of interest to all of us, Coretti insisted. It represents the triumph of man over nature, maneuvering the secrets from nature in spite of her bitter opposition. Poirot nodded his head in agreement. It is indeed admirable what you say there. It is poetic, but, as my friend Hastings reminded me just now, I am only a detective. I appreciate things from a more practical standpoint. This discovery of Sir Claud was worth a great amount of money, eh? Possibly. Corelli's tone was dismissive. I have not given the side of the matter much thought. You are evidently a man of lofty principles, observed Poirot, and also no doubt a man of means. Traveling, for instance, is an expensive hobby. Mine should see the world one lives in, said Corelli dryly. Indeed, Poirot agreed. And the people who live in it. Curious people, some of them. The thief, for instance. What a curious mentality he must have. As you say, Corelli agreed, most curious. And the blackmailer. Poirot continued. What do you mean? Corelli asked sharply. I said the blackmailer. Poirot repeated. There was an awkward pause before he continued. But we are wandering from our subject. The death of Sir Claud Amory. The death of Sir Claud Amory? Why is it that our subject? Of course, Poirot records, you do not yet know. I am afraid that Sir Claud did not die as the result of a heart attack. He was poisoned. He watched the Italian closely for his reaction. Murmured Coretti with a nod of the head. That does not surprise you? Asked Poirot. Frankly, no, Corelli replied. I suspected as much last night. You see then, Poirot continued, that the matter has become much more serious. His turn changed. You will not be able to leave the house today, Dr. Corelli. Leaning forward to Poirot, Corelli asked, do you connect Sir Claude's death with the stealing of the formula? Certainly, Poirot replied. Do not you? Corelli spoke quickly and urgently. Is there no one in this house, no member of his family, who desired the death of Sir Claude, quite apart from any questions of the formula? What does his death mean to most of the people in this house? I will tell you, it means freedom, Monsieur Poirot. Freedom. And what you mentioned just now, money. That older man was a tyrant, and apart from his beloved work, he was a miser. Did you observe all this last night, Monsieur le Docteur? Asked Poirot innocently. What have I did? Replied Corelli. I have eyes. I can see. At least 3 of the people in this house wanted Sir Claude out of the way. He rose and looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. But that does not concern me now. Hastings leaned forward, looking very interested, as Corelli continued, I am vexed that I cannot keep my appointment in London. I am desolated, Monsieur le Docteur, said Poirot, but what can I do? Well, then, you have no further need of me? Asked Corelli. For the moment, no, Poirot told him. Dr. Corelli moved to the door. I will tell you one thing more, Monsieur Poirot, he announced, opening the door and turning back to face the detective. There are some women whom it is dangerous to drive too far. Poirot bowed to him politely, and Corelli returned his bow somewhat more ironically, before making his exit. When Corelli had left the room, Hastings stared after him for a few moments. I say, Poirot, he asked finally, what do you think he meant by that? Poirot shrugged his shoulders. It was a remark of no consequence, he declared. But Poirot, Hastings persisted, I'm sure Corelli was trying to tell you something. Ring your bell once more, Hastings, was the little detective's only response. Hastings did as he was bidden, but could not refrain from a further inquiry. What are you going to do now? Poirot's reply was in his most enigmatic vein. You will see, my dear Hastings. Patience is a great virtue. Treadwell entered the room again with his usual respectful inquiry of, yes, sir? Poirot beamed at him genially. Ah, Treadwell, will you present my compliments to Miss Caroline Amory and ask her if she will be good enough to allow me a few minutes of her time? Certainly, sir. I thank you, Treadwell. When the butler had left, Hastings explained, but the old soul's in bed. Surely you're not going to make her get up if she isn't feeling well. My friend Hastings knows everything. So, she's in bed, yes, what isn't she? Poirot patted his friend's shoulder affectionately. That is just what I want to find out. But surely, Hastings elaborated. Don't you remember? Richard Amory said so. The detective regarded his friend steadily. Hastings, he declared, here is a man killed. And how does his family react? With lies, 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 everywhere. Why does Madame Amory want me to go? Why does Monsieur Amory want me to go? Why does he wish to prevent me from seeing his aunt? What can she tell me that he does not want me to hear? I tell you, Hastings, what we have here is drama. Not a simple, sordid crime, but drama. Poignant, human drama. He looked as though he would have expanded on this theme, had not Miss Amory entered at that moment. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, she addressed him as she closed the door. Treadwell tells me you wanted to see me. Ah yes, mademoiselle, Poirot declared as he went to her. It is just that I would like to ask you a few questions. Will you not sit down? He led her to a chair by the table, and she sat looking at him nervously. But I understood that you were prostrated, ill. Poirot continued as he sat on the other side of the table, and regarded her with an expression of anxious solicitude. Ah, it's all been a terrible shock, of course, Caroline Amory sighed. Really terrible. But what I always say is, somebody must keep their head. The servants, you know, are in a turmoil. Well, she continued, speaking more quickly, you know what servants are, Monsieur Poirot. They positively delight in funerals. They prefer a death to a wedding, I do believe. Now, dear Dr. Graham, he is so kind, such a comfort. A really clever doctor, and of course he's so fond of Barbara. I think it's a pity that Richard doesn't seem to care for him, but what was I saying? Oh, yes, Dr. Graham, so young, and he quite cured my neuritis last year, not that I'm often ill. And this rising generation doesn't seem to be at all strong. And there was poor Lucia last night having to come out from a dinner feeling faint. And of course, poor child, she's a mass of nerves. And what else can you expect with Italian blood in her veins? Though she was not so bad, I remember, when her diamond necklace was stolen. Miss Amory paused for breath. Poirot, while she was speaking, had taken out his cigarette case and was about to light a cigarette. But he paused and took the opportunity to ask her, Madame Amory's diamond necklace was stolen? When was this, mademoiselle? Miss Amory assumed a thoughtful expression. Let me see, it must have been, yes, it was 2 months ago, at just about the same time that Richard had such a quarrel with his father. Poirot looked at the cigarette in his hand. You permit that I smoke, mademoiselle? He asked. And on receiving a smile and a gracious nod of assent, he took a box of matches from his pocket, lit his cigarette, and looked at Miss Amory encouragingly. When that lady made no effort to resume speaking, Poirot prompted her. I think you are saying that Monsieur Amory quarreled with his father, he suggested. Oh, it was nothing serious, Miss Amory told him. It was only over Richard's debts. Of course, all young men have debts, although indeed Claude himself was never like that. He was also studious even when he was a lad. Later, of course, his experiments always used up a lot of money. I used to tell him he was keeping Richard too short of money, you know, but yes, yet about 2 months ago they had quite a scene, and what with that and Lucia's necklace missing and her refusing to call in the police, it was a very upsetting time, and so absurd, too. Nerves, all nerves. You are sure that my smoke is not deranging you, mademoiselle? Asked Poirot, holding up his cigarette toward him. I think gentlemen ought to smoke. Only now noticing that his cigarette had failed to light properly, Poirot retrieved his box of matches from the table in front of him. Surely it is a very unusual thing for a young and beautiful woman to take the loss of her jewels so calmly, he asked, as he lit his cigarette again, carefully replacing 2 dead matches in the box, which he then returned to his pocket. Yes, it is odd. That's what I call it, Miss Amory agreed. Distinctly odd, but there, she didn't seem to care a bit. No, dear, here I am gossiping on about things which can't possibly interest you, Monsieur Poirot. But you interest me enormously, mademoiselle, Poirot assured her. Tell me, when Madame Amory came out from dinner last night feeling faint, did she go upstairs? Oh, no, replied Caroline Amory, who she came into this room. I settled her here on the sofa, and then I went back to the dining room, leaving Richard with her. Young husbands and wives, you know, Monsieur Poirot. Not the John Marin nearly so romantic as they used to be when I was Gil. Oh, dear. And I remember a young fellow called Aloysius Jones. We used to play croquet together. Foolish fellow. Huh? Oh, but there, I'm wandering from the point again. No, we were talking about Richard and Lucia. A very handsome couple they'd make, don't you think so, Monsieur Poirot? He met her in Italy, you know, off the Italian lakes last November. It was love at first sight. They were married within a week. She was an orphan, alone in the world. Very sad. although I sometimes wonder whether it wasn't a blessing in disguise. If she'd had a lot of foreign relations, that would be a bit trying, don't you think? After all, you know what foreigners are. Oh! She suddenly broke off, turning in her chair to look at Poirot in embarrassed dismay. Oh, I do beg your pardon. Not at all, murmured Poirot with an amused glance at Hastings. So stupid of me. Miss Amory apologized, highly flustered. I didn't mean it. Of course it's so different in your case. Les braves Belges, as we used to say during the war. Please do not concern yourself, Poirot assured her. After a pause, he continued, as though her mention of the war had reminded him. I understand that, the box of drugs above the bookcase is a relic of the war. You were all examining it last night, were you not? Yes, that's right, so we were. Now, how did that come about? Inquired Poirot. Miss Amory considered for a moment before replying. Now, how did it happen? Ah, yes, I remember. I said I wished I had some sal volatile, and Barbara got the box down to look through it, and then the gentleman came in, and Dr. Corelli frightened me to death with the things he said. Hastings began to show great interest in the turn being taken by the discussion, and Poirot prompted Miss Amory to continue. You mean the things Dr. Corelli said about the drugs? He looked through them and examined them thoroughly, I suppose? Yes, Miss Amory confirmed, and he held one glass tube up, something with the most innocent name, bromide, I think, which I've often taken for seasickness, and he said it would kill 12 strong men. Hyoscine hydrobromide? Asked Poirot. I beg your pardon? Was it hyoscine hydrobromide that Dr. Corelli was referring to? Yes, that was it, Miss Amory exclaimed. How clever of you! And then Lucia took it from him and repeated something he'd said about a dreamless sleep. I detest this modern neurotic poetry. I always say that ever since dear Lord Tennyson died, no one has written poetry of any— Oh, dear, muttered Poirot. I beg your pardon? Asked Miss Amory. I was just thinking of the dear Lord Tennyson. Please go on. What happened next? Next? You have telling us about last night. Here, in this room. Yes. Barbara wanted to put on an extremely vulgar song. On the gramophone, I mean. Fortunately, I stuck to her. I see, murmured Poirot. And this little tube that the doctor held up, was it full? Oh, yes, Miss Amory replied without hesitation. Because when the doctor made his quotation about dreamless sleep, he said that half the tablets in the tube would be sufficient. Miss Amory got up from her chair and moved away from the table. You know, Monsieur Poirot, she continued as Poirot rose to join her, I've said all along that I didn't like that man, that Dr. Corelli. There's something about him not sincere, and so oily in manner. Of course I couldn't say anything in front of Lucia, since he is supposed to be a friend of hers, but I did not like him. You see, Lucia is so trusting. I'm certain that the man must have wormed his way into her confidence with a view to getting us to the house and stealing the formula. Poirot regarded Miss Amory quizzically before he asked, You have no doubt then that it was Dr. Corelli who stole the sucrose formula? Miss Amory looked at the detective in surprise. What, dear Monsieur Poirot, she exclaimed, who else could have done so? He was the only stranger present. Well, naturally, my brother would not have liked to accuse a guest, so we made an opportunity for the document to be returned. I thought it was very delicately done, very delicately indeed. Quite so. Poirot agreed tactfully, putting a friendly arm around Miss Amory's shoulder, to that lady's evident displeasure. Now, mademoiselle, I am going to try a little experiment in which I would like your cooperation. He removed his arm from her. Where were you sitting last night when the lights went out? There, Miss Amory declared, indicating the settee. Then would you be so good as to sit there once again? Miss Amory moved to the settee and sat. Now, mademoiselle, announced Poirot, I want you to make a strong effort of the imagination. Shut your eyes, if you please. Miss Amory did as she was asked. That is right, Poirot continued. Now, imagine that you are back again where you were last night. It is dark. You can see nothing, but you can hear. Throw yourself back. Interpreting his words literally, Miss Amory flung herself backwards on the settee. No, said Poirot. I mean, throw your mind back. What can you hear? That is right, cast your mind back. Now, tell me what you hear in the darkness. Impressed by the detective's evident earnestness, Miss Amory made an effort to do as he requested. Pausing for a moment, she then began to speak slowly and in jerks. Gasps, she said. A lot of little gasps, and then the noise of a chair falling and the metallic kind of clink. Was it like this? Asked Poirot, taking a key from his pocket and throwing it down on the floor. It made no sound, and Miss Amory, after waiting for a few seconds, declared that she could hear nothing. Well, like this, perhaps. Poirot tried again, retrieving the key from the floor and hitting it sharply against the coffee table. Why, that's exactly the sound I heard last night, Miss Amory explained. How curious. Continue, I pray, mademoiselle, Poirot encouraged her. Well, I heard Lucia scream and call out to Sir Claud, and then the knocking came on the door. That was all? You are sure? Yes, I think so. Wait a minute. Right at the beginning, there was a curious noise like the tearing of silk. Somebody's dress, I suppose. Whose dress do you think? Asked Poirot. But it must have been Lucia's. It wouldn't have been Barbara's because she was sitting right next to me here. That is curious, murmured Poirot thoughtfully. And that really is a wall, as Amory concluded. May I open my eyes now? Oh yes, certainly, mademoiselle. As she did so, Poirot asked her, Who poured out Sir Claude's coffee? Was it you? No, Miss Amory told him. Lucia poured out the coffee. When was that exactly? It must have been just after we were talking about those dreadful drugs. Did Mrs. Amory take the coffee to Sir Claude herself? Caroline Amory paused for thought. No, she finally decided. No? Asked Poirot. Then who did? I don't know. I'm not sure. Let me see now. Oh yes, I remember. Sir Claude's coffee cup was on the table beside Lucia's own cup. I remember that because Mr. Raynor was carrying the cup to Sir Claude in the study, and Lucia called him back and said he had taken the wrong cup, which was really very silly because they were both exactly the same, black without sugar. So, Poirot observed, Monsieur Raynor took the coffee to Sir Claude. Yes, or at least, no, that's right. No, Richard took it from him because Barbara wanted to dance with Mr. Raynor. Oh, so Monsieur Amory took the coffee to his father. Yes, that's correct, Miss Amory confirmed. Ah, explained Poirot. Tell me, what had Monsieur Amory been doing just before that? Dancing? Oh no, Miss Amory replied. He'd been packing away the drugs, putting them all back in the box. I see. Sir Claude then drank his coffee in his study. Why, I suppose he began to do so, Miss Amory remembered, but he came back in here with the cup in his hand, I remember his complaining about the taste, saying that it was bitter. And I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, it was the very best coffee, and a special mixture that I had ordered myself from the Army and Navy stores in London. You know, that wonderful department store in Victoria Street. It's so convenient, not far from the railway station, and She broke off as the door opened, and Edward Rayner entered. Am I interrupting? The secretary asked. I'm so sorry. I wanted to speak to Monsieur Poirot, but I can come back later. No, declared Poirot. I have finished putting this poor lady upon the rack. As Amory rose, and if I hadn't been able to tell you anything useful, she apologized as she went to the door. Poirot rose and walked ahead of her. You have told me a great deal, mademoiselle. More than you realize, perhaps, he assured Miss Amory as he opened the door for her. After seeing Miss Amory out, Poirot turned his attention to Edward Rayner. Ah, Monsieur Rayner, he said as he gestured the secretary to a chair. Let me hear what you have to tell me. Rayner sat and regarded Poirot earnestly. Mr. Amory has just told me the news about Sir Claud. The cause of his death, I mean. This is the most extraordinary business, monsieur. It has come as a shock to you? Asked Poirot. Well, certainly I never suspected such a thing. Approaching him, Poirot handed Rayner the key that he had found, watching the secretary keenly as he did so. Have you ever seen this key before, Monsieur Rayner? He asked. Rayner took the key and turned it about in his hands with a baffled air. Well, it looks rather like the key to Sir Claud's safe, he observed. But I understand from Mr. Amory that Sir Claud's key was in its proper place on his chain. He handed the key back to Poirot. Yes, this is a key to the safe in Sir Claud's study, but it is a duplicate key, Poirot told him, adding slowly and with emphasis, a duplicate, which was lying on the floor beside the chair you occupied last night. Rayner looked at the detective unflinchingly. If you think it was I who dropped it, you are mistaken, he declared. Poirot regarded him searchingly for a moment, and then nodded his head as if satisfied. I believe you, he said. Moving briskly to the settee, he sat down and rubbed his hands together. Now, let us get to work, Monsieur Rayner. You were Sir Claud's confidential secretary, were you not? That's correct. Then you know a lot about his work. Yes, I have a certain amount of scientific training, and I occasionally helped him with his experiments. Do you know anything, asked Poirot, that can throw light upon this unfortunate affair? Rayner took a letter from his pocket. Only this, he replied as he rose, moved across to Poirot and handed him the letter. One of my tasks was to open and sort out all of Sir Claud's correspondence. This came 2 days ago. Poirot took the letter and read it aloud. You are nourishing a viper in your bosom. Bosom? He queried, turning to Hastings before continuing. Beware of Selma Gertz and her brood. Your secret is known. Be on your guard. It is signed, Watcher. Very picturesque and dramatic. Hastings, you will enjoy this, Poirot remarked, passing the letter to his friend. What I would like to know, declared Edward Rayner, is this. Who is Selma Gertz? Leaning back and putting his fingertips together, Poirot announced, I think I can satisfy your curiosity, monsieur. Selma Gertz was the most successful international spy ever known. She was also a very beautiful woman. She worked for Italy, for France, for Germany, and eventually, I believe, for Russia. Yes, she was an ordinary woman, Selma Betts. Reno stepped back a pace and spoke sharply. Was? She is dead, Poirot declared. She died in Germany last November. He retrieved the letter from Hastings, who had been shaking his head over it with a perplexed expression. Then this letter must be a hoax, Reno exclaimed. I wonder, Poirot murmured. Selma Gertz and her brood, it says. Selma Gertz left their daughter, Monsieur Reno, a very beautiful girl. Since her mother's death, she has disappeared completely. He put the letter in his pocket. Could it be possible that... Reno began, then paused. Yes? You were going to say something, monsieur? Poirot prompted him. Moving to the detective, Reno spoke eagerly. Mrs. Amory's Italian maid. She brought her from Italy with her, a very pretty girl. Vittoria Muzio, her name is. Could she possibly be this daughter of Selma Gertz? Ah, it is an idea that... Poirot sounded impressed. Well, let me send her to you, Reno suggested, turning to go. Poirot rose. No, in little minute. Above all, we must not alarm her. Let me speak to Madame Amory first. She will be able to tell me something about this girl. Perhaps you're right, Reno agreed. I'll tell Mrs. Amory at once. The secretary left the room with the air of a determined man, and Hastings approached Poirot in great excitement. That's it, Poirot. Corellium, the Italian maid, in collusion, working for a foreign government. Don't you agree? Deep in thought, Poirot paid his colleague no heed. Poirot, don't you think so? I said it must be Corelli and the maid working together. Ah, yes, that is exactly what you would say, my friend. Hastings looked affronted. Well, what's your idea? He asked Poirot in an injured tone. There are several questions to be answered, my dear Hastings. Why was Madame Amory's necklace stolen 2 months ago? Why did she refuse to call in the police on that occasion? Why... He broke off as Lucia Amory entered the room, carrying her handbag. I understand you wanted to see me, Monsieur Poirot. Is that correct? She asked. Yes, madame. I would like simply to ask you a few questions. He indicated a chair by the table. Won't you sit down? Lucia moved to the chair and sat as Poirot turned to Hastings. My friend, the garden outside that window is very fine, Poirot observed, taking Hastings by the arm and propelling him gently towards the French windows. Hastings looked distinctly reluctant to leave, but Poirot's insistence, though gentle, was firm. Yes, my friend. Observe the beauties of nature. Do not ever lose a chance of observing the beauties of nature. Somewhat unwillingly, Hastings allowed himself to be bundled out of doors. Then, the day being warm and sunny, he decided to make the best of his present situation and explore the Amory's garden. Ambling across the lawn, he made his way towards a hedge, beyond which a formal garden looked extremely inviting. As he walked along the length of the hedge, Hastings became aware of voices quite close by. Voices which, as he approached, he recognized as those of Barbara Amory and Dr. Graham, who were, it seemed, enjoying a tete-a-tete on a bench just the other side of the hedge. In the hope that he might overhear something relevant to Sir Claud Amory's death, or the disappearance of the formula that it would be useful for Poirot to know, Hastings stopped to listen. To perfectly bear that he thinks his beautiful young cousin can do better for herself than a country doctor. That seems to be the basis of his lack of enthusiasm for our seeing each other, Kenneth Graham was saying. Oh, I know Richard can be an old stick in the mud at times and carry on like someone twice his age, Barbara's voice replied. I don't think you ought to allow yourself to be affected by it, Kenny. I certainly don't take any notice of him. Well, I shan't either, said Dr. Graham. But look here, Barbara, I asked you to meet me out here because I wanted to talk to you privately without being seen or heard by the family. First of all, I ought to tell you that there can be no doubt about it. Your uncle was poisoned last night. Oh, yes? Barbara sounded bold. You don't seem at all surprised to hear that. Oh, I suppose I'm surprised. After all, members of one's family don't get poisoned every day, do they? I have to admit that I'm not particularly upset that he's dead. I think I'm glad. Barbara. Now, don't you stop pretending you're surprised to hear that, Kenny. You've listened to me going on about the mean old so-and-so on countless occasions. He didn't really care for any of us. He was only interested in his moldy old experiments. He treated Richard very badly, and he wasn't particularly welcoming to Lucia when Richard brought her back from Italy as his bride. And Lucia's so sweet, so absolutely right for Richard. Barbara, darling, I have to ask you this. Now, I promise that anything you say to me will go no further. I'll protect you if necessary. But tell me, do you know something, anything at all about your uncle's death? Have you any reason to suspect that Richard, for example, might have felt so desperate about his financial situation that he would think of killing his father in order to get his hands now on what would eventually be his inheritance? I don't want to continue this conversation, Kenny. I thought you asked me out here to whisper sweet nothings to me, not to accuse my cousin of murder. Darling, I'm not accusing Richard of anything. But you must admit there's something wrong here. Edge of his uncle's death. It's almost as though he were afraid of what it might reveal. There's no way he can stop the police from taking over, of course, but he's made it perfectly clear that he's furious with me for having instigated an official investigation. I was only doing my duty as a doctor, after all. How could I possibly have signed a death certificate stating that Sir Claud had died of a heart attack? But for heaven's sake, there was absolutely nothing wrong with his heart when I last gave him a regular checkup only a few weeks ago. Kenny, I don't want to hear any more. I'm going indoors. Now make your own way out through the garden, won't you? I'll see you another time. Oh, Barbara, I only want— But she had already gone. Dr. Graham emitted a deep sigh that was almost a groan. At that moment, Hastings thought it expedient to retrace his steps quickly back to the house, without being seen by either of them. Back in the library, it was only after Hastings, propelled by Hercule Poirot, had made his unwitting exit into the garden, that the little detective turned his attention again to Hercule Amory, first taking care to close the French windows. Hercule looked at Poirot anxiously. You want to ask me about my maid, I understand, Monsieur Poirot. That is what Mr. Reynaud told me, but she is a very good girl. I'm sure there's nothing wrong with her. Madame, Poirot replied, it is not about your maid that I wish to speak to you. Hercule sounded startled as she began. But Mr. Reynaud said— Poirot interrupted her. I am afraid I allowed Mr. Reynaud to think so for reasons of my own. Well, what is it then? Lucia's voice was guarded now. Madame, Poirot observed, you paid me a very pretty compliment yesterday. You said when you first saw me, you said that you trusted me. Well, when am I ask you to trust me now? What do you mean? Poirot observed her solemnly. You have youth, beauty, admiration, love, all the things a woman wants and craves. But there is one thing, madame, that you lack. A father confessor. Let Papa Poirot offer himself for the post. Lucia was about to speak when Poirot interrupted her. No. Think well before you refuse, madame. It was at your request that I have remained here. I stayed to serve you. I still wish to serve you. With a sudden flash of temperament, Lucia replied, You can serve me best now by going, monsieur. Madame, Poirot continued imperturbably. Do you know that the police have been called in? The police? Yes. But by whom? And why? Dr. Graham and the other doctors, his colleagues, Poirot told her, have discovered that Sir Claud Amory was poisoned. Oh no. No. Or not that? Lucia sounded more horrified than surprised. Yes. So you see, madame, there is very little time for you to decide on the most prudent course of action. At present I serve you. Later, I may have to serve justice. Lucia's eyes searched Poirot's face as though trying to decide whether to confide in him. At last, "What do you want me to do?" she asked falteringly. Poirot sat and faced her. "What will you?" he murmured to himself. And then, addressing Lucia, he suggested gently, "Why not simply tell me the truth, madame?" Lucia paused. Stretching out her hand towards him, she began, I... She paused again irresolutely, and then her expression hardened. "Really, Monsieur Poirot, I am at a loss to understand you." Poirot eyed her keenly. "Ah, it is to be like that, is it? I am very sorry." Her composure somewhat regained, Lucia spoke coldly. "If you will tell me what you want with me, I will answer any questions you wish to ask." "So," the little detective exclaimed, "you pit your wits against Hercule Poirot, do you? Very well then. Be assured, however, madame, that we shall get at the truth just the same. It's at the table, but by a less pleasant process." "I have nothing to conceal," Lucia told him defiantly. Taking from his pocket the letter Edward Raynor had given him, Poirot handed it to Lucia. "A few days ago, Sir Claude received this anonymous letter," he revealed. Lucia glanced through the letter, apparently unmoved. "Well, what of it?" she commented as she handed it back to Poirot. "Have you heard the name Selma Gretz before?" "Never." "Who is she?" asked Lucia. "She died in Genoa last November," Poirot informed her. "Indeed?" "Perhaps you met her there," Poirot remarked, replacing the letter in his pocket. "In fact, I think you did." "I was never in Genoa in my life," Lucia insisted sharply. "Then if anyone were to say that they had seen you there, they would be mistaken." Poirot persisted.